At 8 a.m. on the 8th of December 1941, Japanese forces began landing on the beaches of Kota Baru in northeastern Malaya. The British command at Singapore received word of the landings. Everything seemed normal. The plan had been in place for decades. If Japan attacked, the Royal Navy would sail east from Singapore to intercept. The fortress was considered impregnable. Only a few minutes later, something was off. The Japanese were not coming from the sea. They were coming over land, through the jungle that British planners had declared impassable. By 11 a.m., the Japanese had secured their beachhead. At 1 p.m., the commander of the British forces in Malaya, Lieutenant General Arthur Percival, ordered a limited counterattack. It was too slow. The Japanese advanced along the eastern coast using bicycles and small boats. At 4 p.m., the British airfields in northern Malaya were bombed. By nightfall, the Japanese had pushed 20 miles inland. The British defenders fell back. At 6:30 a.m. on the 10th of December 1941, the battleship HMS Prince of Wales and the battle cruiser HMS Repulse steamed north from Singapore without air cover. They were the heart of the British naval deterrent. By 11 a.m., Japanese bombers had spotted the ships. At 12:30 p.m., the Repulse was hit by a torpedo. At 1:20 p.m., the Prince of Wales went down. Over 800 British sailors died. The Japanese had no battleships in the area. They did not need them. The loss of the two capital ships was a shock to the British High Command. The plan had been to use the Navy to protect Malaya. Now the Navy was at the bottom of the South China Sea. The Japanese had air superiority. They had local naval control. The British had no answer. At the same time, Japanese forces were sweeping down the Malay Peninsula. They moved faster than the British could retreat. Villages fell. Bridges were captured. The defenders were cut off from each other. At 9 a.m. on the 11th of January 1942, Kuala Lumpur was abandoned without a fight. The British had not expected to lose the capital so quickly. Percival ordered a withdrawal to the southern tip of Malaya, across the causeway into Singapore Island. The causeway was a narrow strip of road and rail linking the mainland to the island fortress. The British destroyed it behind them. They believed the Japanese could not cross the Johor Strait. On the 31st of January 1942, the last British troops crossed into Singapore. The causeway was blown up at 8:15 a.m. Water poured through the gap. For a moment, it seemed the island was safe. The Japanese had no landing craft. They had no heavy artillery across the strait. But the British had made a critical miscalculation. At 11:30 p.m. on the 7th of February 1942, the Japanese began an artillery barrage on the northwestern shore of Singapore. The British had expected an attack from the northeast, where the main naval base was located. The Japanese had built simple wooden boats. They had constructed rafts. They had moved their artillery into the rubber plantations on the mainland, hidden from aerial reconnaissance. The bombardment was intense. The British defenders were stretched thin. At 10 p.m. on the 8th of February, The first wave of Japanese troops crossed the strait in collapsible boats. The British machine guns opened fire, but the line was too long. The Japanese found gaps. By 2 a.m. on the 9th of February, they had established a beachhead. The British counterattacked the next morning, but the Japanese were already inland. They captured the reservoirs. The water supply to the city of Singapore was threatened. At 8 a.m. on the 11th of February, Japanese forces reached the outskirts of the city. The British had concentrated their remaining troops around the naval base and the city center, but they had no reserves. The Japanese commander, General Tomoyuki Yamashita, was short on ammunition and supplies. He knew he had to take Singapore quickly before his own logistics collapsed. He sent a demand for surrender. Percival refused. Fighting continued for 3 more days. The Japanese advanced street by street. At 9:30 a.m. on the 14th of February, the Japanese captured the Alexandra Military Hospital. They killed patients and staff. The British forces were surrounded. They had no air cover. They had no heavy artillery. The water was running out. At 5 p.m. that day, the Japanese began a final assault on the Bukit Timah Heights. The British positions collapsed. At 6 a.m. on the 15th of February 1942, Percival held a meeting with his senior commanders. They discussed whether to continue resistance or surrender. The ammunition was almost gone. The reserves of food and water were depleted. There was no hope of relief. The decision was made to surrender. At 6:15 p.m. on the 15th of February 1942, Percival walked to the Ford Motor Factory on Bukit Timah Road. He carried a white flag. He met Yamashita inside. The British general surrendered unconditionally. Over 80,000 British, Australian, and Indian troops became prisoners of war. The civilian population of Singapore, more than 1 million people, came under Japanese occupation. What happened? The fall of Singapore was not a single moment of bad luck. It was the result of a chain of decisions, assumptions, and systemic failures that stretched back decades. The British had built Singapore as the keystone of their imperial defense in the Far East. The strategy was simple: station a powerful fleet at Singapore, and any Japanese aggression would be deterred or defeated. The base was constructed at great expense. Huge drydocks were built. Coastal guns were installed, pointing outward to sea. The landward approaches across the Johor Strait and through the jungle of Malaya were considered impassable for a modern army. The British did not fortify the north of the island. They did not train troops for jungle warfare. They assumed the Japanese were not capable of such an operation. These assumptions were flawed. The Japanese military had studied the terrain. They had trained in jungle conditions. They had built a network of airfields in southern Indochina. They had overwhelming air power. The British, meanwhile, had spread their forces across a vast empire. The Royal Navy was engaged in the Atlantic and the Mediterranean. There were no capital ships to spare for Singapore after the sinking of the Prince of Wales and Repulse. The Air Force in Malaya was outnumbered and outclassed. The British Army was composed of raw recruits, colonial units, and Indian divisions that had not been equipped for mobile warfare. The commanders on the ground were also part of the problem. Percival was cautious and slow. He had repeatedly been warned by intelligence officers that the Japanese would advance through the jungle, but he did not change his dispositions. He spread his forces thinly along the coast of Malaya, allowing the Japanese to concentrate their attacks. When the retreat began, he gave contradictory orders. Units were redeployed too late. Bridges were left intact long enough for the Japanese to cross. The system of imperial defense itself was built on a hierarchy of racial assumptions. British officers believed that Japanese soldiers were physically inferior, lacked mechanical skill, and would not fight at night. These beliefs were false. The Japanese soldier was well-trained, aggressive, and highly motivated. The British soldiers, many of them conscripted from India and Malaya, had been told they would face an inferior enemy. Morale suffered when that expectation was shattered. The event still matters because it was the most humiliating defeat in British military history. It ended the myth of British invincibility in Asia. The surrender of a garrison that outnumbered the attackers by more than 2-1 was a catastrophic failure of leadership and planning. The loss of Singapore led directly to the collapse of British prestige across the region. Within a year, nationalist movements in India, Burma, and Malaya gained momentum. The British never fully recovered their authority in the Far East. After the war, the empire began to unravel. The sun that had never set on the British Empire was, by the time of the surrender at the Ford Motor Factory, already dipping below the horizon. In the months that followed, the consequences of that surrender rippled across Asia. At 8 o'clock in the morning on the 18th of February 1942, the first groups of British and Australian prisoners of war were marched into Changi prison camp on the eastern side of Singapore Island. The camp was designed for 600 inmates. Over 50,000 prisoners were soon crammed inside. The conditions were brutal from the start. There was little food. There was no medicine. The guards enforced a regime of hard labor and summary execution. The prisoners were ordered to build an airstrip, then a railway. Many were sent north to a place called Kanchanaburi in Thailand. They were forced to cut through rock and jungle with hand tools. The Burma Railway would become one of the most notorious symbols of Japanese brutality during the war. Over 12,000 Allied prisoners died building it. Another 90,000 Asian laborers perished alongside them. But the disaster of Singapore was not an isolated event. It was part of a pattern of imperial overreach, miscalculation, and systemic neglect that would eventually bring down the entire British Empire. To understand how that happened, we have to look at the events that followed the fall of Singapore. The Japanese did not stop at the Malay Peninsula. They pushed into Burma. On the 19th of February 1942, Japanese aircraft bombed the port of Rangoon. The British had stationed a small garrison there, but they had no air cover. The city fell on the 8th of March. The British retreated into the jungle, walking north toward India. It was a disorganized retreat. Men dropped from exhaustion. Officers abandoned their units. The Japanese followed close behind, cutting off stragglers and capturing supplies. By the summer of 1942, the Japanese had reached the border of India. The British prepared to defend Assam. The situation looked desperate. At 10 o'clock in the morning on the 25th of March 1942, the British commander in Burma, General Harold Alexander, ordered a final withdrawal across the Chindwan River. The bridges were destroyed behind him. The retreating columns were harried by Japanese patrols. One division, the 17th Indian, was cut off and had to break out through a Japanese roadblock in a battle that lasted 3 days. By the end of March, the British had lost all of Burma. The oil fields, the rice paddies, the deep-water ports were now in Japanese hands. The supply route to China was severed. The Japanese now stood at the gates of India. What happened in Burma was a direct consequence of the fall of Singapore. The British had assumed that Malaya and Singapore were the key to the region. They had not prepared for a war in the jungle of Burma. The troops were untrained. The equipment was inadequate. The medical supplies were lacking. The Japanese, by contrast, had spent years preparing for this campaign. They had studied the terrain. They had built airfields and supply depots. They moved faster than the British could react. The British retreat from Burma was as humiliating as the surrender of Singapore. It confirmed that the empire in Asia was on the edge of collapse, but the worst was yet to come. The fall of Burma cut off the supply of rice to India. The Indian economy was already strained by the war. Military procurement had diverted transportation and labor. The monsoon of 1942 was poor in the province of Bengal. The rice crop failed. The British administration, under the Viceroy Lord Linlithgow, did not treat this as a crisis. They were focused on the war effort. They feared that food aid would be diverted to the enemy. They were also concerned about Indian nationalist movements. The Quit India movement, launched in August 1942, had led to mass arrests. The British viewed any disruption with suspicion. When reports of food shortages reached Calcutta, officials dismissed them as exaggerated. At 6 o'clock in the morning on the 1st of October 1942, the price of rice in the city of Calcutta had already doubled from its pre-war level. By December, it had quadrupled. The poor could not afford to buy food. The government did not impose price controls. They did not import grain from Australia or the United States. Winston Churchill, the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, wrote a memo to his Minister of Food. I do not see why there should be any special difficulty about the Indian famine. The Indians have been living on the verge of starvation for centuries. They will do so again. Churchill diverted ships carrying wheat to Europe instead of to India. He refused to release military aircraft to transport supplies. He wanted the food for British soldiers and for European allies. At 9 o'clock in the morning on the 15th of March 1943, a group of Indian doctors from the Calcutta Medical College sent a letter to the Viceroy. They reported that people were dying in the streets. They described families eating leaves and grass. They asked for immediate relief. The letter was filed. No action was taken. By April, the death toll was climbing. The monsoon arrived in June 1943, but it brought flooding, not relief. The infrastructure for distributing food had collapsed. The British officials in the countryside were more concerned with collecting taxes and preventing black markets than with feeding the starving. The British imposed a policy of denial to prevent rice from falling into Japanese hands if they invaded. They confiscated boats and destroyed grain stores in coastal districts. This policy actually made the famine worse. The fishermen and farmers who depended on those boats for transport and trade could no longer earn a living. They became refugees. They walked to the cities hoping for help. At 11 o'clock in the morning on the 26th of August 1943, the British administration finally acknowledged the scale of the disaster. They admitted that people were dying, but they still refused to allow free imports of grain. Instead, they set up relief camps. The camps were underfunded and poorly managed. Thousands of people arrived each week. The camps had no sanitation. The food was insufficient. Diseases like cholera and dysentery spread rapidly. In September, the British announced that the worst of the famine was over. It was not. The death toll continued to climb. What happened in Bengal was not a natural disaster. It was a man-made famine. The cyclone of 1942 had damaged the rice crop, but the famine itself was caused by policy decisions made in London and Calcutta. The British government chose to prioritize the war effort over the lives of Indian civilians. They refused to implement price controls. They refused to import grain. They refused to use military transport. They refused to listen to Indian experts who warned of catastrophe. The result was the death of an estimated 3 million people. The exact number is still disputed. Some historians put it as high as 4 million. The victims were mostly rural poor, landless laborers and women. The British maintained control. The empire continued, but the moral authority of that empire had been shattered. How could this have happened? The question still haunts historians. The British had the resources to prevent the famine. Australia and Canada had surplus wheat. The Royal Navy had ships. The Royal Air Force had transport planes. But the decision-makers in London were focused on winning the war in Europe. They viewed India as a secondary theater. They were also deeply prejudiced against Indian competence and resilience. Churchill's comment about Indians living on the verge of starvation was not an isolated remark. It reflected a wider belief within the imperial administration that Indian lives were less valuable than European lives. The famine was not inevitable. It was the result of choices. The aftermath of the Bengal famine was complicated. The British launched an official inquiry in 1944, but it was limited in scope. The inquiry concluded that there had been failures in communication and administration, but it did not blame any individual. No one was held accountable. The famine became a political issue for Indian nationalists. It was used to argue that the British could not be trusted to govern India after the war. The famine also had long-term effects on the health and productivity of the region. Millions of survivors were weakened. The birth rate dropped. The economy of Bengal never fully recovered. The event still matters because it reveals the dark underside of imperial rule. The British Empire was not simply about bringing civilization, railways, and law. It was also about extraction, exploitation, and the devaluation of human life. The famine showed that the empire could sacrifice entire populations for its own strategic interests. It also showed that the imperial system was not a monolithic machine. It was a collection of individuals making decisions, often based on flawed information, prejudice, and bureaucratic inertia. The fall of Singapore and the Bengal famine were two of the most devastating events in the history of the British Empire. They occurred within less than 2 years of each other. Together, they marked the beginning of the end. The war would continue for another 2.5 years. The British would eventually retake Burma and Malaya. They would accept the surrender of Japan in Singapore in September 1945. But the authority of the empire had been fatally wounded. The soldiers who had surrendered at Singapore would return to a Britain that was bankrupt. The survivors of the Bengal famine would see Indian independence in 1947. The empire was not dismantled by a single event. It was eroded by a series of disasters, each one exposing systemic failures. At 12:30 on the afternoon of the 15th of August 1947, the British flag was lowered at the Red Fort in Delhi. India and Pakistan became independent. The partition of the subcontinent was accompanied by violence and mass migration. Over 1 million people died. The British left quickly, leaving behind a divided region. The sun that had never set on the empire was now setting over the Indian subcontinent. The empire would not last much longer in Africa or the Middle East. By the 1960s, most of the British colonies had gained independence. The course of the 20th century was shaped by the collapse of this empire. The disaster of Singapore and the horror of Bengal are not just historical footnotes. They are essential to understanding why the empire fell. The question remains, could the British Empire have survived? The answer is likely no. The war had changed the world. The United States and the Soviet Union emerged as superpowers. Both were opposed to colonialism, at least in principle. The British economy was drained. The morale of the imperial administration was broken. The people of Asia and Africa no longer believed in the inevitability of British rule. The disasters of Singapore and Bengal accelerated a process that had already begun. The empire was not killed by a single blow. It died of 1,000 cuts. Some of those cuts were self-inflicted. The story of the British Empire is often told in terms of glory, expansion, and progress. But the real history is also about failure, cruelty, and collapse. The sun that never set was also the sun that burned too brightly, exhausting the resources and the will of the people who lived under it. By the time the war ended, the empire had lost its moral justification. The world had seen it fail to protect its subjects. The fall of Singapore was not just a military defeat, it was a symbol of the end of an era. At 10 o'clock in the morning on the 12th of September 1945, the Japanese commander in Singapore, General Seishiro Itagaki, walked into the municipal building on St. Andrews Road. He signed the instrument of surrender. The British flag was raised again, but it was a hollow victory. The city had been devastated. The population had suffered 3.5 years of occupation. The British returned to a colony that no longer respected them. The resources were gone. The prestige was gone. Within 20 years, Singapore would leave the British Empire, becoming an independent republic. The events of 1942 to 1945 reshaped the world. They taught us that empires are not eternal. They are built on assumptions that can be shattered in a single disastrous campaign. The British Empire had lasted for centuries. It collapsed in a few years. The fall of Singapore was the turning point. After that, nothing was the same. At 8 minutes past 3 in the afternoon on the 30th of January 1948, Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi stepped into the garden of Birla House in New Delhi. He was on his way to a prayer meeting, as he had done almost every day for years. He walked slowly, supported by two young women. As he reached the top of the steps, a man named Nathuram God stepped forward and fired 3 bullets into Gandhi's chest and abdomen. Gandhi fell. He died within minutes. The assassin was a Hindu nationalist who believed Gandhi had been too sympathetic to Muslims. The murder was not a random act of violence. It was the culmination of years of political and religious tension that the British had helped to create through their policy of divide and rule. What happened in the months after independence? The partition of India and Pakistan had been announced on the 3rd of June 1947. The British had determined the borders with remarkable speed. Sir Cyril Radcliffe, a British lawyer who had never been to India before, was given just 5 weeks to draw the boundary line. He worked with outdated maps and incomplete demographic data. On the 17th of August 1947, 2 days after independence, the Radcliffe Line was published. It divided the Punjab and Bengal in ways that made no sense on the ground. Villages were split, roads were cut, families found themselves on opposite sides of a new international border. An estimated 14 million people crossed the new boundaries. Hindus and Sikhs moved east into India. Muslims moved west into Pakistan. Along the way, they were attacked by mobs. Trains full of refugees arrived in cities like Lahore and Amritsar, with all passengers murdered. The death toll from the partition violence is estimated at between 1 million and 2 million people. The British did not intervene. They had already transferred power. The responsibility was now in the hands of the new governments. The question arises, could the British have prevented the violence? The answer is complicated. The British had encouraged communal divisions for decades. They had reserved separate electorates for Muslims and Hindus. They had promoted the Muslim League as a counterweight to the Indian National Congress. They had allowed tensions to fester. When the time came to leave, they did so quickly, leaving chaos behind. The partition was not inevitable. It was the result of a choice to prioritize a swift exit over a stable transfer. The British wanted to leave India before the end of 1947. They succeeded, but the cost was paid in blood. Now consider the broader dissolution of the empire. After India, the other colonies began to fall away. Burma achieved independence in January 1948. Ceylon, now Sri Lanka, followed in February 1948. The British had hoped to maintain influence through economic ties and defense agreements, but the momentum was against them. In Palestine, the British mandate ended in May 1948. The State of Israel was declared. British forces withdrew, leaving behind a conflict that continues to this day. In Malaya, a state of emergency was declared in 1948 against a communist insurgency. The British fought a long counterinsurgency campaign, finally granting independence in 1957. In Africa, the Gold Coast became Ghana in 1957. Nigeria followed in 1960. Kenya in 1963. The list goes on. By the mid-1960s, the British Empire had effectively ceased to exist. Only a handful of small territories remained, most of which still retain formal ties to the United Kingdom today. At 9 o'clock in the morning on the 21st of February 1948, the British government issued a statement in London. It announced that the British Raj in India had ended. The king had ceased to be Emperor of India. The title, Emperor of India, was removed from the royal coat of arms. The change was symbolic but profound. The sun had set. The empire had lost its largest and most valuable possession. Without India, the empire was no longer a global power. The British economy, already weakened by the war, could not sustain the costs of maintaining far-flung colonies. The United States provided loans, but demanded that Britain dismantle its imperial trade preferences. The British were forced to accept the new reality. They were no longer a superpower. How could an empire that had lasted for more than 2 centuries collapse so quickly? The answer lies in the structure of the empire itself. The British Empire was built on a combination of military force, economic control, and cultural influence. But it was always fragile. It depended on the cooperation of local elites, the discipline of a small colonial administration, and the credibility of British power. When that credibility was shattered at Singapore in 1942, the empire's foundations cracked. When the Bengal famine in 1943 revealed the empire's indifference to human life, the moral authority disappeared. When the war ended, Britain was bankrupt and exhausted. The colonies saw their chance. The national movements that had been building for decades suddenly found their moment. Take the example of Kenya. At 4 o'clock in the afternoon on the 20th of October 1952, the British governor of Kenya, Sir Evelyn Baring, declared a state of emergency. The Mau Mau Rebellion had begun. The Mau Mau were primarily members of the Kikuyu ethnic group who were protesting the loss of land to white settlers. The British response was brutal. They arrested thousands of suspected rebels. They imposed collective punishment on villages. They established detention camps where prisoners were tortured and beaten. The number of Kenyans killed during the emergency is disputed. British sources claim 11,000. African sources claim as many as 120,000. The British did not win the conflict through military superiority alone. They also used political concessions. In 1960, they agreed to a new constitution that gave Africans a majority in the legislature. Kenya became independent on the 12th of December 1963. The Mau Mau Rebellion had failed to achieve its immediate goals, but it had forced the British to accelerate the transfer of power. What did the British leave behind? In many colonies, they left a legacy of infrastructure, legal systems, and administrative structures. They also left unresolved conflicts, artificial borders, and economic dependency. In Palestine, the British Mandate created a state of war between Jews and Arabs. In India, partition led to a cycle of violence that continues to shape the region. In Africa, the borders drawn by European powers ignored ethnic and linguistic divisions, leading to civil wars after independence. The empire was not a benevolent project. It was an extractive enterprise. The wealth of the colonies flowed to Britain. The people of the colonies were subjected to forced labor, taxation, and discrimination. The empire enriched Britain, but it impoverished much of the rest of the world. The decline of the British Empire was not a single event. It was a process that unfolded over decades. The Suez Crisis of 1956 was another turning point. At 7 o'clock in the evening on the 29th of October 1956, Israeli forces invaded Egypt. Britain and France followed with airstrikes and ground troops. The goal was to regain control of the Suez Canal, which the Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser had nationalized. The operation was a disaster. The United States demanded an immediate ceasefire. The Soviet Union threatened intervention. Britain was forced to withdraw within a week. The crisis revealed that Britain could no longer act as an independent world power. The empire was finished. After Suez, the British government adopted a policy of rapid decolonization. They realized that holding onto colonies was no longer worth the cost. At 10 o'clock in the morning on the 31st of August 1957, the Federation of Malaya became independent. The British flag was lowered for the last time in Kuala Lumpur. The ceremony was attended by British officials, Malay royalty, and representatives of the Chinese and Indian communities. The mood was hopeful, but the underlying tensions remained. Malaya had been a source of rubber and tin for the British economy. The new government would have to manage ethnic divisions and economic inequality. The British left, but they did not sever all ties. Malaya joined the Commonwealth, a voluntary association of former colonies. The Commonwealth became a way for Britain to maintain influence without the cost of direct rule. The end of the British Empire was not a single moment of collapse. It was a gradual dissolution. By the mid-1960s, most of Africa had become independent. In 1965, the British government declared that it would no longer defend colonies against external aggression. The message was clear. The empire was over. The remaining territories, such as Hong Kong, Gibraltar, and the Falkland Islands, were retained for strategic or economic reasons. Hong Kong was returned to China in 1997. The Falklands were defended in a war with Argentina in 1998, but these were exceptions. The empire as a global system had ceased to exist. What is the legacy of the British Empire today? It is a subject of intense debate. Some argue that the empire brought progress, law, and democracy. Others point to the exploitation, violence, and racism. The truth is complex. The empire was neither wholly good nor wholly evil. It was a system of power that served British interests at the expense of others. The deaths of millions, the destruction of cultures, and the imposition of artificial borders are undeniable. The railways, postal systems, and legal institutions are also undeniable. But the benefits of the empire were not distributed equally. The British benefited disproportionately. The colonized people carried the burden. The story of the British Empire is not just about events, it is about people. The soldiers who died in the jungles of Malaya, the farmers who starved in Bengal, the refugees who walked across the new borders of India and Pakistan, the rebels who were hanged in Kenya, the administrators who believed they were doing good, the politicians who made decisions that led to disaster. The empire was made by human choices. It was unmade by human choices as well. At 9 o'clock in the morning on the 1st of July 1997, the British flag was lowered over Government House in Hong Kong. The handover ceremony was attended by Prince Charles and the British Prime Minister Tony Blair. The Chinese flag was raised. The British Empire's last major colony was gone. The flag that had flown over Hong Kong for 150 years was folded and taken away. The empire that had once claimed a quarter of the world's land and a fifth of its population was reduced to a few scattered islands. The sun had set. The empire was over. But the effects of the empire are still felt. The English language is spoken across the globe. The legal systems of many countries are based on British common law. The game of cricket is played in former colonies. The borders drawn by British cartographers still define nations. The ethnic tensions they created still lead to conflict. The empire is not just history. It is alive in the present. The patterns of power, wealth, and inequality that were established during the imperial era continue to shape the world. The British Empire is gone, but its shadow remains long. At 12 minutes past 3 on the afternoon of the 11th of November 1965, the Speaker of the Rhodesian Parliament read a proclamation. The session had been called in secret. The gallery was empty. The members of the Rhodesian Front Party sat in silence. The proclamation declared that Southern Rhodesia was no longer a British colony. It was now an independent state under the rule of the white minority government led by Prime Minister Ian Smith. The British government in London received the news within minutes. Prime Minister Harold Wilson condemned the act as illegal. He called it a rebellion. He imposed economic sanctions, but he did not send troops. The Royal Navy was not dispatched to the Cape. The British Army did not move. The rebellion was allowed to stand. What happened? Southern Rhodesia had been a self-governing colony since 1923. The white settlers controlled the government, the police, and the land. The black African majority had no vote in any meaningful sense. When Britain began decolonizing Africa in the late 1950s, the white Rhodesians feared the same fate. They watched as Kenya, Zambia, and Malawi gained independence under black majority rule. They decided to act before Britain could force change on them. The Unilateral Declaration of Independence, or UDI, was a direct challenge to the Crown. The British government could have crushed the rebellion with a single battalion. But the political will did not exist. The British public had no appetite for another colonial war. The army was already overstretched in other theaters, and many in the British establishment secretly sympathized with the white Rhodesians. The rebellion was left to fester. For the next 15 years, Rhodesia existed as a pariah state. Economic sanctions were imposed by the United Nations, but they were never fully enforced. Oil was smuggled through South Africa. Trade continued through front companies. The white farmers produced tobacco and maize. The black workers labored on the farms for wages that were a fraction of what a white worker would earn. The political system was designed to exclude the majority. The Constitution reserved seats for whites. The voting system was rigged. The security forces were armed and trained by the British before UDI. They used those weapons against black nationalists who demanded freedom. Two guerrilla armies, ZANU and ZAPU, fought a bitter war in the countryside. The war lasted from 1972 to 1979. It killed tens of thousands of people, mostly black civilians caught between the army and the guerrillas. At 9 o'clock in the morning on the 18th of April 1980, the British flag was lowered in Salisbury for the last time. The ceremony was held at Rougharo Stadium. The Prince of Wales represented the Queen. The new president, Canaan Banana, stood on the podium. The independence of Zimbabwe, as the country was now called, had been negotiated at Lancaster House in London the previous year. The agreement gave the white minority guaranteed seats in Parliament for 7 years. It also guaranteed that land would be redistributed only on a willing seller, willing buyer basis. That clause was a compromise. It was designed to protect white farmers. It failed to address the land hunger of the black majority. The war had been brutal. The British had not won it. The guerrillas had not won it either. It was a stalemate. The Lancaster House Agreement was a ceasefire, not a solution. The legacy of Rhodesia and Zimbabwe is still visible. At 11 o'clock on the morning of the 15th of November 2017, Robert Mugabe, the president of Zimbabwe since independence, was placed under house arrest by the military. He had ruled for 37 years. The economy had collapsed. Hyperinflation had destroyed savings. Land seizures from white farmers after 2000 had led to a sharp drop in food production. The farms that had once fed the region lay fallow. The people who had fought for independence watched their children struggle to find work. The infrastructure that the British had built, the roads, the railways, the schools, had crumbled. The borders that the British had drawn still existed. The ethnic divisions between the Shona and the Ndebele, which the British had exacerbated through divide and rule policies, still simmered. The shadow of the empire was not just political. It was economic, social, and psychological. But the legacy of the British Empire is not limited to southern Africa. Consider the case of Nigeria. At 10 o'clock in the morning on the 1st of October 1960, the British High Commissioner in Lagos lowered the Union Jack. Nigeria became independent. The new flag, green and white, was raised. It was a moment of celebration. The country was wealthy. It had oil, palm oil, cocoa, and rubber. It had a population of over 40 million people. It had a constitution modeled on the British parliamentary system. But the constitution had a flaw. It divided the country into three regions. The northern region was dominated by the Hausa Fulani ethnic group. The western region was dominated by the Yoruba. The eastern region was dominated by the Igbo. The British had created these divisions deliberately. They had used indirect rule through local chiefs. They had favored the North as a counterweight to the more educated South. The Constitution gave the North a majority in the federal parliament. The South resented it. The tensions boiled over within 6 years. At 2 o'clock in the afternoon on the 15th of January 1966, a group of military officers, mostly Igbo, staged a coup. They killed the prime minister, the finance minister, and many northern politicians. The coup failed. The new military government was led by General Johnson Agui Ironsi, an Igbo. He tried to unify the country by abolishing the regions. The North saw this as an Igbo takeover. In July 1966, a counter-coup killed Ironsi and brought a northern general, Yakubu Gowon, to power. The violence against Igbos living in the north escalated. Thousands were killed. The survivors fled east. The Igbo leaders decided they could no longer live in a country where they were not safe. On the 30th of May 1967, the eastern region seceded and declared the independent Republic of Biafra. At 5 o'clock in the morning on the 6th of July 1967, the Nigerian Federal Army attacked Biafra. The war lasted 2.5 years. It was fought with weapons supplied by Britain. The British government supported Nigeria because it was the larger country and because oil concessions were at stake. The Biafrans were outgunned and outnumbered. The Federal Army used a blockade to starve the population into submission. By 1968, Images of starving Biafran children appeared on television screens around the world. The British government refused to intervene. The war ended on the 12th of January 1970 with Biafra's surrender. Over 1 million people had died, most of them from starvation. The British Empire had created Nigeria. The British Empire had drawn the borders that forced competing ethnic groups into a single state. When that state collapsed into war, Britain chose to support the side that had oil. The shadow of the empire was visible in the white bones of the children who died in Biafran refugee camps. The story of the British Empire is also the story of the people who were moved across the empire against their will. At 6 o'clock in the evening on the 4th of August 1972, President Idi Amin of Uganda announced that all Asians living in Uganda must leave the country within 90 days. The Asians were mostly the descendants of Indians who had been brought to East Africa by the British to build the railway and work as traders. The British had encouraged this migration. They had used the Indian community as a middleman between the white settlers and the African population. The Indians built businesses, banks, schools, and hospitals. They became the commercial backbone of the country, but they were never fully accepted. When Amin came to power, he saw them as a foreign elite. He expelled them. They were forced to leave behind their homes, their shops, their savings. Many had British passports. The British government was reluctant to accept them. The first flights landed at Stansted Airport in London. The refugees had nothing. The empire had brought them to Africa. The empire abandoned them when they needed protection. At 11 o'clock in the morning on the 9th of December 1961, the British flag was lowered in Dar es Salaam. Tanganyika became independent. The new Prime Minister, Julius Nyerere, had been educated at the University of Edinburgh. He spoke English with a Scottish accent. He admired the British parliamentary system. He believed in democracy, socialism, and self-reliance. He was one of the few African leaders who voluntarily gave up power later in life. But the country he inherited had problems that the British had created. The colonial economy was based on the export of sisal, coffee, and cotton. The British had built a railway that connected the interior to the coast, but they had not built roads to connect the regions to each other. The education system was designed to produce clerks, not engineers. The civil service was staffed by British officials who left within 2 years. Nyerere had to build a nation from the pieces the British had left behind. He tried to create a unified culture by promoting Swahili as the national language. He tried to create an economy based on communal farming. Both efforts had mixed results. The legacy of the empire was a state that was stable but poor, a population that was educated but not skilled, and an economy that was dependent on foreign aid. The shadow of the empire was the shadow of structural dependency. At 7 o'clock in the evening on the 25th of June 1975, the Portuguese flag was lowered in Lourenço Marques. Mozambique became independent. But Mozambique was not a British colony. It was Portuguese. Why mention it? Because the borders of Mozambique were drawn by European powers at the Berlin Conference of 1884. The British Empire had a seat at that table. The British Empire helped draw the lines that separated Mozambique from its neighbors. The lines ignored the cultures and languages of the people who lived there. The lines separated the Makonde people in the north from their kin in Tanzania. The lines separated the Shona in the west from their kin in Rhodesia. The lines created a country that had to struggle for decades to find a national identity. The same story could be told of almost every country in Africa. The borders were drawn by men in suits who had never visited the continent. The borders were drawn to serve European interests. The borders were drawn to prevent any single colony from becoming too powerful. The borders were drawn to carve up the continent into manageable pieces for extraction. That legacy is still visible in every conflict over land, water, and resources on the African continent. At 10 o'clock in the morning on the 31st of August 1963, the British flag was lowered in Aden. The colony of Aden became part of the Federation of South Arabia. The British had controlled Aden since 1839. It was a strategic port on the route to India. It was a coaling station for the Royal Navy. It was a base for operations in the Middle East. But by the 1960s, the nationalist movement in Yemen was growing. The British responded by trying to create a federation of local sheikdoms. It did not work. The nationalist fighters backed by Egypt attacked British forces. The British sent more troops. They built a defensive perimeter around the base. They used aircraft to bomb rebel villages. It was a guerrilla war. The British lost control. In November 1967, the last British soldier left Aden. The base was abandoned. The colony was handed over to the nationalist forces. Within 2 years, the country descended into a civil war that lasted for decades. The shadow of the empire was the shadow of a failed exit strategy. At 9 o'clock in the morning on the 31st of December 1983, the British flag was lowered in Brunei. The Sultanate of Brunei became fully independent. Brunei was a small oil-rich state on the island of Borneo. The British had protected it for over a century. They had installed a sultan who was loyal to the crown. They had trained the army. They had managed the oil revenues. When independence came, the sultan kept his absolute power. The constitution was suspended. The parliament was dissolved. The people had no say in how the oil money was spent. The British left behind a country that was wealthy but authoritarian. The oil wealth was used to buy loyalty. The schools taught English. The legal system was based on English common law. But the rights that English common law guaranteed did not apply in Brunei. The shadow of the empire was the shadow of an unfinished project. The British had introduced the idea of democracy, but they had not built the institutions to support it. They had introduced the idea of law, but they had not taught the people to demand their rights. They had introduced the idea of freedom, but only for those who were already in power. The British Empire also left a legacy in the Caribbean. At 3 o'clock in the afternoon on the 6th of August 1962, Jamaica became independent. The ceremony was held at the National Stadium. Princess Margaret represented the Queen. The new Prime Minister, Alexander Bustamante, gave a speech. He talked about the future. He did not talk about the past. The past was a history of slavery, sugar plantations, and colonial exploitation. The British had brought millions of Africans to the Caribbean as slaves. They had worked them to death on the plantations. When slavery was abolished in 1834, the British paid compensation to the slave owners, not to the slaves. The slave owners used the money to invest in new industries. The slaves were left with nothing. They had no land. They had no education. They had no political power. The British then brought in indentured laborers from India and China to replace the former slaves. The division between Afro-Caribbean and Indo-Caribbean communities persists to this day. The legacy of the empire in the Caribbean is a legacy of racial tension, economic dependency, and a culture that looks to London for validation. The cricket teams play the game that the British taught them. The legal systems are based on British law. The languages are English, but the values are not always British. The shadow of the empire is the shadow of an identity that was formed under the whip. At 11 o'clock in the morning on the 31st of December 1997, the British flag was lowered in the Turks and Caicos Islands. But that was not a handover. It was a ceremony to mark a new constitution. The Turks and Caicos are still a British overseas territory. They remain under the Crown. The governor is appointed by London. The police are supervised by the British. The courts can appeal to the Privy Council. The people are British citizens, but they have no representation in the British Parliament. They are not allowed to elect their own head of state. They are not independent. They are not a colony in the traditional sense, but they are not fully free either. They are a remnant of the empire. There are 14 such territories today: Anguilla, Bermuda, British Virgin Islands, Cayman Islands, Falkland Islands, Gibraltar, Montserrat, Pitcairn Islands, St. Helena, South Georgia, sovereign base areas of Akrotiri and Dhekelia, Turks and Caicos, British Indian Ocean Territory. The last one, the British Indian Ocean Territory, is a particularly bitter legacy. The British forced the entire population of the Chagos Islands off their homeland in the 1960s and 1970s to make way for an American military base on Diego Garcia. The Chagosians were resettled in Mauritius and Seychelles. They have never been allowed to return. The British government has refused to pay compensation. The shadow of the empire is the shadow of a people who were erased from the map. At 8 o'clock in the morning on the 23rd of June 2016, the United Kingdom voted to leave the European Union. The decision was close, 52% to 48%. But the reasons behind the vote were complex. Some voters wanted to take back control from Brussels. Some voters wanted to reduce immigration. Some voters wanted to revive Britain's global trading role. The rhetoric of the campaign was filled with nostalgia for the days when Britain was a great power. The campaign promised that leaving the EU would allow Britain to reassert its sovereignty and reclaim its place in the world. The supporters of Brexit often invoked the legacy of the empire. They talked about Commonwealth trade deals. They talked about the English-speaking world. They talked about the bonds of history. But the empire was gone. The Commonwealth was not a trade bloc. The English-speaking world did not guarantee preferential treatment. The global trading system was governed by rules, not sentiment. The shadow of the empire was the shadow of a delusion. Many British people believed that the empire still mattered. They believed that Britain could be great again. But greatness is not a title that can be reclaimed by nostalgia. It is built on resources, relationships, and respect. The empire had provided none of those in its final years. At 9 o'clock in the evening on the 8th of September 2022, Queen Elizabeth II died at Balmoral Castle. She had reigned for 70 years. She had seen the empire dissolve. She had seen the colonies become independent. She had seen the Commonwealth grow from 8 member states to 54. She had traveled across the world to visit the places where the Union Jack had once flown. She had been received with warmth and respect in many of them. But the legacy of the empire was not erased by the Queen's grace. The protests that followed her death in the Caribbean, the calls for reparations, the demands for an apology, were reminders that the empire was not a closed chapter. At the funeral, the prime ministers of India, Pakistan, Kenya, Jamaica, and many other former colonies attended. They stood in Westminster Abbey. They listened to the hymns. They remembered. But the empire was not about memories. It was about power. It was about land. It was about lives. The sun had set, but the heat of the day still lingered. At 4 o'clock in the morning on the 21st of October 1952, the British colonial government in Kenya declared a state of emergency. The governor, Sir Evelyn Baring, signed the order. The reason was the growing violence of the Mau Mau rebellion. Mau Mau was a Kikuyu-led movement that rejected British rule and demanded land and freedom. They had attacked government officials, burned farms, and killed loyalist Africans. The British response was immediate and overwhelming. Troops were deployed. Arrests began. The leader of the Kenya African Union, Jomo Kenyatta, was taken into custody. He was accused of masterminding the rebellion. The British believed that by removing the leadership they could crush the uprising in weeks. They were wrong. By November 1952, the state of emergency had expanded. The British military brought in reinforcements from other colonies. The Royal Air Force flew sorties over the forests of the Aberdare Range and Mount Kenya. The ground forces included the King's African Rifles, the Kenya Regiment, and units from the British Army. They were supported by the Home Guard, Kikuyu loyalists armed and trained by the British. The rebels had no formal military. They fought with homemade weapons, stolen firearms, and a fierce belief in their cause. They used the dense forests as cover. They launched hit-and-run attacks on police posts and settler farms. The British response was not a counterinsurgency in the modern sense. It was a punitive campaign. The goal was not just to defeat the rebels. It was to break the spirit of the Kikuyu people. At 9 o'clock in the morning on the 24th of April 1953, the British launched Operation Anvil. It was the largest single operation of the campaign. The army surrounded Nairobi, the capital. They set up roadblocks. They searched every African home in the city. They detained over 30,000 Kikuyu, Mbu, and Meru men. The women and children were left behind. The men were taken to screening camps. The British officials interrogated them. Anyone suspected of being a Mau Mau supporter was sent to a detention camp. The camps were scattered across Kenya. The conditions were brutal. The prisoners were forced to work. They were beaten. They were subjected to what the British called dilution tactics, a program of forced confessions and re-education. The goal was to make the prisoners renounce Mau Mau and swear allegiance to the crown. Those who resisted were tortured. The British used waterboarding, beatings, sleep deprivation, and sexual humiliation. The methods were later documented in secret files that remained hidden for decades. At 10:15 in the morning on the 17th of November 1954, a group of British officers discovered a mass grave in the Ola camp. Ola was a detention camp in eastern Kenya. It held what the British called hardcore Mau Mau prisoners. The officers found 11 prisoners dead in the compound. The official report said they died from drinking water from a contaminated source, but the prisoners had been beaten to death. The British authorities covered it up. They falsified medical reports. They threatened witnesses. The Ola massacre was not an isolated incident. It was part of a pattern. By the time the state of emergency ended in 1960, over 100,000 Kenyans had been detained. At least 20,000 had been killed. The exact number is unknown because the British did not keep accurate records of the deaths. The landscape of Kenya was transformed. The forests were cleared. The villages were relocated. The Kikuyu people were moved into fortified settlements called villagization. The British destroyed homes. They confiscated livestock. They burned crops. The purpose was to deny the rebels food and shelter. But the effect was collective punishment. Entire communities were displaced. The trauma of that period is still felt in Kenya today. What happened after the state of emergency? In August 1959, the British government formally requested an inquiry into the Ola massacre. The inquiry was led by a British judge, Sir Patrick Windayer. He concluded that the prisoners had been beaten to death by camp guards. He ordered prosecution, but no one was convicted. The guards were not named. The British colonial administration refused to cooperate. The cover-up was successful. The victims' families received no compensation. The British government continued to deny the scale of the violence for decades. It was not until 2013 that the British government acknowledged the abuses and agreed to pay compensation. But the amount was small. The families of 3,000 victims shared a total of £20 million. For each family, that was less than £7,000. The British government did not apologize. The shadow of the empire was the shadow of a silence that lasted 60 years, How could this have happened? The British colonial system was built on a hierarchy of race. The white settlers held the power. The African population was viewed as subjects, not citizens. The legal system was designed to protect colonial interests. The British soldiers and administrators operated with impunity. The emergency laws gave them the authority to detain without trial, to search without warrant, to use lethal force without consequence. The system normalized violence against the colonized. The Mau Mau Rebellion was a challenge to that system. The British responded with the full force of a state that believed it was fighting for civilization. They saw the rebels as barbarians. They saw themselves as bringing order. But the order they brought was the order of the camp, the curfew, the beating, the execution. The system failed because it was designed to fail. It was designed to suppress, not to understand. The legacy of the Mau Mau uprising is still debated. In Kenya, the rebellion is remembered as a key step toward independence. The British tried to destroy the memory of Mau Mau. They banned the movement. They burned the oaths. They erased the names of the leaders from official records. But the Kikuyu passed down the story orally. In the 1960s, after independence, the new Kenyan government under Jomo Kenyatta did not celebrate Mau Mau. Kenyatta had been imprisoned by the British, but he also had political rivals within the Mau Mau movement. He chose to marginalize them. The veterans of the rebellion were not given land. They were not given pensions. They were pushed to the edges of society. The shadow of the empire was the shadow of a revolution that was denied its heroes. At 11 o'clock in the morning on the 12th of December 1963, the British flag was lowered in Kenya. The ceremony was held at the Uhuru Gardens in Nairobi. Prince Philip represented the Queen. He handed over the instruments of independence to Jomo Kenyatta. The crowd cheered. The new Prime Minister gave a speech. He called for unity. He called for forgiveness. He did not mention the camps. He did not mention the massacre. He did not mention the thousands who had died. The British officials left. The British investments remained. The British legal system remained. The British education system remained. The British cultural influence remained. The Kenyan economy was still tied to London. The cash crops, the infrastructure, the banking system, all were designed for the benefit of the empire. Independence meant political control, but not economic liberation. The new government inherited a country that was poor, divided, and traumatized. At 6 o'clock in the evening on the 20th of February 1964, the Kenyan Parliament debated a motion to change the constitution. The motion proposed turning Kenya into a republic. The British monarch would no longer be the head of state. The debate was short. The vote was overwhelming. Kenya became a republic on the 12th of December 1964, exactly 1 year after independence. Jomo Kenyatta became the first president. The Constitution gave him sweeping powers. The Parliament could not override his decisions. The judiciary was appointed by the president. The press was controlled. The trade unions were suppressed. The pattern was not unique to Kenya. It was repeated across Africa. The British had not built democratic institutions. They had built colonial institutions. When the British left, the institutions did not change. They simply changed hands. The new leaders used the same tools of control that the British had used. The shadow of the empire was the shadow of an authoritarian structure that outlived the colonial administrators. How does the Mau Mau story matter today? In 2013, the British government finally admitted that some of its forces had tortured detainees in Kenya. The admission came after years of legal pressure from the victims' families. The British government paid the compensation, but it refused to apologize. The Prime Minister, David Cameron, called the abuses a stain on Britain's reputation. But he did not say sorry. The Kenyan government also did not push for a full accounting. The relationship between Britain and Kenya remained strong. Britain was a major trading partner. The British military continued to train in Kenya. The Kenyan elite sent their children to British schools. The shadow of the empire was the shadow of a partnership that was built on forgetting. At 2 o'clock in the afternoon on the 5th of October 2018, a Kenyan historian named Caroline Elkins published a book titled Legacy of Violence. She was a professor at Harvard. She had spent years in the British archives. She had uncovered the full extent of the British counterinsurgency in Kenya. The book documented the massacres, the torture, the forced labor, the destruction of villages. The British government tried to prevent the book from being published. They threatened legal action. They argued that the documents were still covered by the Official Secrets Act. But the book was published anyway. It was awarded the Pulitzer Prize for History. The British government did not respond. The shadow of the empire was the shadow of a history that could not be suppressed, but that was also not fully confronted. At 9 o'clock in the morning on the 31st of August 2022, the British High Commission in Nairobi released a statement. It was the 75th anniversary of the end of the Mau Mau Rebellion. The statement acknowledged the suffering. It mentioned the compensation. It did not mention the cover-up. It did not mention the failure to prosecute. It did not mention the families who still live in poverty. The statement was brief. It was forgotten within a day. The heat of the day still lingered. At 8 o'clock in the morning on the 3rd of June 1947, the British Viceroy of India, Lord Louis Mountbatten, held a press conference in New Delhi. The room was crowded with journalists from across the world. Mountbatten was calm, but the announcement he made would alter the lives of 400 million people. He declared that the British would leave India by the 15th of August of that same year. The date was 10 months earlier than the original plan. The reason was simple. The British government had decided it could no longer control the violence between Hindus and Muslims. The partition of India was being accelerated. The borders would be drawn by a British lawyer named Sir Cyril Radcliffe, who had never visited India before. He was given 5 weeks to divide a subcontinent. What happened next was chaos. The Radcliffe Line was announced on the 17th of August, 2 days after independence. It split the provinces of Punjab and Bengal along religious lines. But the line was drawn without regard for villages, families, or local economies. People woke up on the morning of independence to find themselves in a different country. The trains that were supposed to carry people across the new border became death traps. At 10 o'clock in the morning on the 15th of August 1947, a train from Lahore to Amritsar arrived at its destination. It carried no passengers, only bodies. The British had not prepared for the transfer of population. They had not stationed enough troops. They had not anticipated the scale of the violence. In the weeks that followed, an estimated 1 million people died. 12 million were displaced. The dead were not counted by the British. The official record was silent. The shadow of the empire was the shadow of a border drawn in haste. How could this have happened? The British had ruled India for nearly 200 years. They had built railways, roads, schools, and a unified legal system. But they had also deepened the divisions between Hindus and Muslims. The British policy of divide and rule had encouraged separate electorates and separate political parties. When the British finally decided to leave, they wanted to do so quickly. Winston Churchill had called partition a terrible prospect, but he was out of power by 1947. The Labour government under Clement Attlee was facing a bankrupt economy and a shattered military. The British could not afford to stay in India. The decision to withdraw was a financial one as much as a political one. The cost of maintaining order was too high. The British left behind a legacy of blood and a border that is still disputed today. At 11 o'clock in the evening on the 14th of August 1947, Jawaharlal Nehru gave his famous Tryst with Destiny speech in the Constituent Assembly in New Delhi. He spoke of the end of one era and the beginning of another. He did not mention the violence. He did not mention the partition. He did not mention the British. The speech was broadcast across the country and around the world. The British officials who heard it understood that the empire was truly over in South Asia, but the aftermath was not clean. The princely states, which had been semi-independent under British suzerainty, had to choose which nation to join. The state of Hyderabad was annexed by India in 1948. The state of Jammu and Kashmir was claimed by both India and Pakistan. The British had left the issue unresolved. They had given the princely rulers the choice, but they had not guaranteed a peaceful transition. The first war between India and Pakistan over Kashmir began in October 1947. The British tried to mediate, but their influence was waning. The empire that had once claimed to bring order left behind a region perpetually at war. At 9 o'clock in the morning on the 1st of January 1948, the British government officially transferred the last of its military assets in India to the new governments. The ceremony was held at the Red Fort in Delhi. The Union Jack was lowered. The Indian flag was raised. The British troops marched away. But the legacy of the empire remained in the institutions. The Indian civil service, the judiciary, the military, and the railway system were all based on British models. The Indian elite spoke English. The Indian legal system used British common law. The Indian education system followed British curricula. The British had not built a democracy. They had built a bureaucracy. That bureaucracy survived the empire. In Pakistan, the military was modeled on the British Army. The first Prime Minister, Liaquat Ali Khan, was a British-trained lawyer. The civil service was staffed by British-trained officers. The shadow of the empire was the shadow of a system that outlived its creators. At 4 o'clock in the afternoon on the 31st of January 1948, a group of British soldiers boarded a ship in Bombay Harbor. They were the last of the British troops to leave India. The ship sailed for Britain. The soldiers watched the coast disappear. Many of them had been born in India. They had families there. They were leaving a country that had been their home for generations. The British government had offered them no resettlement plan. They were simply no longer needed. The empire had collapsed faster than anyone had predicted. In the years that followed, the British government struggled to absorb the returning soldiers, the colonial administrators, and the families who had built their lives abroad. The shadow of the empire was the shadow of an empire that abandoned its own people. At 2 o'clock in the morning on the 26th of July 1956, the President of Egypt, Gamal Abdel Nasser, gave a speech in Alexandria. He announced that Egypt was nationalizing the Suez Canal. The canal was a vital waterway connecting the Mediterranean to the Red Sea. It was owned by a British and French company. The British government had controlled the canal militarily since 1880. Nasser's move was a direct challenge to British power in the Middle East. The British Prime Minister, Anthony Eden, was furious. He saw Nasser as a new dictator, a threat to British interests. Eden began planning a military response. The British government believed that the empire could still project force. They were wrong. At 5 o'clock in the afternoon on the 29th of October 1956, Israeli forces invaded the Sinai Peninsula. This was the first phase of a secret plan. The British and French would then issue an ultimatum for both sides to withdraw from the Canal Zone. When Egypt refused, British and French forces would bomb Egyptian airfields and land troops. The plan was executed. British bombers struck Egyptian targets on the 31st of October. Paratroopers landed on the 5th of November. But the international reaction was immediate. The United States was furious. President Dwight Eisenhower had not been informed of the plan. The Soviet Union threatened to intervene. The United Nations demanded a ceasefire. The British government faced a run on the pound. The American government refused to provide financial support unless Britain withdrew. By the 6th of November, Eden agreed to a ceasefire. The British and French forces left Egypt in December. The Suez Crisis was a humiliating defeat for the empire. It showed that Britain could no longer act independently without American approval. The shadow of the empire was the shadow of a power that had become a junior partner. At 10 o'clock in the morning on the 9th of January 1957, Anthony Eden resigned as Prime Minister. His health had deteriorated. His reputation was destroyed. He had tried to restore the empire's prestige, but he had only hastened its decline. The British government began a reevaluation of its global role. The empire had cost too much to maintain. The British economy was weak. The British military was stretched thin. The British public was tired of war. In the years that followed, the British government accelerated the process of decolonization. In 1957, Ghana became independent. In 1960, Nigeria. In 1963, Kenya. In 1964, Zambia and Malawi. In 1965, Singapore. In 1966, Botswana and Lesotho. In 1968, Mauritius. In 1970, Fiji. In 1971, Bahrain, Qatar, and the United Arab Emirates. The empire was being dismantled piece by piece. The British government did not mourn it. They simply moved on. At 3 o'clock in the afternoon on the 2nd of April 1982, the Argentine military invaded the Falkland Islands. The islands were a British overseas territory in the South Atlantic. They were home to about 1,800 British citizens. The British government was taken by surprise. The Prime Minister, Margaret Thatcher, was determined to defend the islands. She sent a naval task force. The British public rallied behind her. The war lasted 74 days. The British forces retook the islands. The Argentine forces surrendered. The British flag was raised again. But the war was a reminder that the empire still had remnants. The Falklands were not economically valuable. They were a symbol. The British government had chosen to fight for a small island thousands of miles away. The cost was high. 255 British soldiers died. 3 Argentine soldiers died. The war was a gamble that paid off for Thatcher's political career, but it did not revive the empire. The shadow of the empire was the shadow of a distant island that few could locate on a map. At 9 o'clock in the morning on the 1st of July 1997, the British flag was lowered over Government House in Hong Kong. The ceremony was held in a driving rain. Prince Charles represented the Queen. The Chinese flag was raised. Hong Kong was handed over to the People's Republic of China. The British had ruled Hong Kong for 155 years. The handover was the end of the British Empire. The British government had negotiated the terms in 1994. The agreement guaranteed a one country, two systems arrangement for 50 years. The British left behind a prosperous city, a legal system based on common law, and a population that spoke English. But the handover was also a moment of loss. The British had built Hong Kong into a global financial center. They had also suppressed dissent. They had used the colony as a military base. They had extracted wealth. The handover was not a celebration. It was a quiet transfer of power. The shadow of the empire was the shadow of a city that no longer belonged to Britain. How does the empire matter today? In 2023, the British government still had 14 overseas territories. They included places like Gibraltar, Bermuda, the Cayman Islands, and the British Virgin Islands. These territories were remnants of a global empire. They were small, but they held strategic and financial importance. The British government continued to provide defense and diplomatic representation. The territories had varying degrees of autonomy. The citizens of these territories were British citizens, but the relationship was not equal. The British government retained the power to impose laws, to dissolve local governments, to control foreign policy. The shadow of the empire was the shadow of a continuing colonial relationship. At 1 o'clock in the afternoon, on the 11th of June 2020, a statue of the British colonialist Cecil Rhodes was removed from the University of Oxford. The removal was part of a global movement to reassess the legacy of the empire. Protesters had demanded the removal for years. The university finally agreed. The statue was taken down. The debate did not end. Historians argued over whether removing statues erased history. Others argued that keeping them glorified oppression. The British government did not take a strong stance. The Prime Minister at the time, Boris Johnson, had written a book about Churchill and the Empire. He defended the idea of the empire. He called it a force for good. But the evidence did not support his view. The empire had caused destruction. The empire had killed millions. The empire had exploited resources. The empire had left a legacy of inequality. The debate over the empire was not a debate about the past. It was a debate about the present. At 7 o'clock in the evening on the 25th of October 2021, the British government released a report on the future of the Commonwealth. The report was titled, "The Commonwealth in a Changing World." It called for the Commonwealth to be more relevant to young people. It called for increased trade and cooperation. The report did not address the empire. It did not mention the violence of colonization. It did not mention the forced labor. It did not mention the cultural erasure. The British government wanted the Commonwealth to be a positive force, but the Commonwealth was a product of the empire. The members were mostly former colonies. The head of the Commonwealth was still the British monarch. The organization was a way for Britain to maintain influence. The shadow of the empire was the shadow of a network that was still controlled from London. At 10 o'clock in the morning on the 8th of September 2022, Queen Elizabeth II died at Balmoral Castle in Scotland. She had been the head of the Commonwealth for 70 years. Her death marked the end of an era. She had witnessed the end of the empire. She had seen the transition from colony to independence. She had remained a symbol of stability, but the empire she represented was gone. The new king, Charles III, inherited a different Britain. The country was smaller. The population was diverse. The economy was fragile. The British government was no longer a global power. The sun had set on the empire. The heat of the day had faded. What remained was a memory, a legacy of pain and privilege, of violence and progress. The empire was a story that was still being written. The shadow of the empire was the shadow of a history that would not let go. At 11 o'clock in the morning, on the 29th of March 2023, the British Supreme Court delivered its judgment in a case concerning the Chagos Islands. The court ruled that the British government's decision to keep control of the islands was unlawful. The judges stated that the Chagosians had been wrongfully removed from their homeland. The ruling was a victory for the former inhabitants. But the British government did not accept the judgment immediately. The Foreign Office issued a statement expressing disappointment. The government said it would consider the ruling, but would not commit to returning the islands. The Chagos Islands remained under British control. The United States continued to operate a military base on Diego Garcia. The base was considered vital for American military operations in the Middle East and Asia. The British government argued that the security of the base was paramount. The Chagosians remained exiled. Their homeland was still occupied. The shadow of the empire was the shadow of an island that was taken, emptied, and never returned. What happened in the Chagos Islands? The story began in the 1960s. The British government was preparing to grant independence to Mauritius. Mauritius included the Chagos archipelago. The British government wanted to keep the islands. They wanted to lease Diego Garcia to the United States for a military base. In 1965, the British government created the British Indian Ocean Territory. They detached the Chagos Islands from Mauritius. The population was about 2,000 people. They were mostly laborers, farmers, and fishermen. They had lived on the islands for generations. The British government did not consult them. They did not ask for their consent. They simply decided to remove them. At 6 o'clock in the morning on the 21st of April 1967, the first group of Chagosians was loaded onto a ship. The ship was called the Nordvair. It was a cargo vessel. The passengers were told they were being moved for their own good. They were not given time to pack. They were not allowed to bring their belongings. They were taken to Mauritius and Seychelles. They were left in unfamiliar places. They had no homes. They had no jobs. The British government paid them compensation, but the amounts were small. The removal continued over the next few years. By 1973, the islands were empty. The Chagosians were scattered. Their culture was destroyed. Their language was lost. Their identity was erased. At 10 o'clock in the morning on the 3rd of February 1971, the United States began construction of the base on Diego Garcia. The base became a strategic asset. It was used in the Gulf War, the war in Afghanistan, and the war in Iraq. The British government provided the territory. The United States provided the funding. The arrangement was secret. The public did not know the full extent of the base. The Chagosians were forgotten. They were not allowed to return. They were not allowed to visit. The islands were closed. How did the Chagosians fight back? They organized. They formed associations. They hired lawyers. They took the British government to court. The first case was filed in 1975. The British government argued that the removal was legal. The courts ruled in favor of the government. The Chagosians appealed. They lost again. They appealed again. In 2000, the High Court ruled that the removal was unlawful. The government was ordered to allow the Chagosians to return. But the government did not comply. They passed new laws to block the return. They argued that the islands were uninhabitable. They said the water was contaminated. They said the infrastructure was destroyed. The Chagosians argued that the government had created the conditions. The government had dismantled the buildings. The government had polluted the water. The government had made the islands uninhabitable on purpose. At 3 o'clock in the afternoon on the 25th of February 2019, the International Court of Justice issued an advisory opinion. The court stated that the British government had wrongfully separated the Chagos Islands from Mauritius. The court ordered the British government to return the islands within 6 months. The British government refused. The United Nations General Assembly voted in favor of the opinion. 116 countries voted yes, 6 voted no. The United Kingdom and the United States were among the no votes. The British government said the opinion was not binding. They said the base was essential for global security. They said they would not leave. At 11 o'clock in the morning on the 29th of March 2023, the Supreme Court ruling changed nothing. The British government did not act. The government said they would examine the judgment. They said they would consider their options. But the islands remained under British control. The Chagosians remained in exile. Many of them died without seeing their homeland. The older generation remembered the palm trees and the clear water. The younger generation knew only the stories. The Chagos Islands became a symbol of the empire's ongoing violence. The empire was not over. It had simply changed form. The shadow of the empire was the shadow of a legal system that could not force a government to obey its own courts. The shadow of the empire was the shadow of a military base that mattered more than human rights. The shadow of the empire was the shadow of a people who had been displaced, silenced, and erased from the map. And yet the story did not end. In the years that followed, new generations of Chagosians continued to demand justice. They organized protests outside the British Parliament. They met with diplomats. They wrote letters. They spoke at the United Nations. They refused to accept that their homeland was gone. They insisted that the islands were still theirs. The British government did not listen. But the world was watching. At 9 o'clock in the morning on the 10th of November 2023, a delegation of Chagosians met with the British Foreign Secretary. The meeting was brief. The Foreign Secretary repeated the government's position. The security of the base was non-negotiable. The Chagosian leaders left the room without a commitment. They returned to their makeshift communities in Mauritius. They continued to wait. The empire had promised freedom. It had delivered occupation. The empire had promised progress. It had delivered displacement. The empire had promised civilization. It had delivered destruction. The sun had set on the British Empire, but the night was not dark. The night was filled with the voices of those who had been left behind. The night was filled with the memory of islands that were taken. The night was filled with the shadow of a power that would not release its grip. So the empire remained, not as a political entity, but as a wound, not as a memory, but as a living injustice. The British government continued to govern 14 overseas territories. The British monarchy continued to be the head of the Commonwealth. The British flag continued to fly over distant lands. The British military continued to use bases in former colonies. The British financial system continued to rely on offshore tax havens that were once colonial possessions. The empire was not over, it had become something else. It had become a system of power that was harder to see but still present. At 6 o'clock in the evening on the 1st of January 2024, the clock struck midnight. A new year began. In London, fireworks lit up the sky. In Port Louis, Mauritius, Chagosians gathered in a community center. They sang songs in a language that was nearly extinct. They told stories of an island that no longer existed. They remembered the sound of the waves on the beach. They remembered the smell of the coconut trees. They remembered the feeling of the sun on their skin. They were not celebrating. They were remembering. The shadow of the empire was the shadow of a memory that would not let go. The shadow of the empire was the shadow of a history that was still being written. The sun had set, but the heat remained. The empire was over, but its consequences were not. The story of the British Empire was not a story of the past. It was a story of the present, and it would continue until justice was done. At 10 o'clock in the morning on the 3rd of October 2024, the British government issued a joint statement with Mauritius. The announcement came from the Foreign Office in London and the Prime Minister's office in Port Louis. The United Kingdom agreed to transfer sovereignty of the Chagos Islands to Mauritius. The deal included a 99-year lease for the military base on Diego Garcia. The United States welcomed the agreement. The Chagosian leaders were not in the room when the deal was drafted. They learned about it from news reports. What happened next was not a celebration. The Chagosian community in Mauritius gathered outside the British High Commission. They held signs that read, "Nothing about us without us." They pointed out that the agreement did not guarantee their right to return. The lease for the base was longer than any living Chagosian's lifespan. The islands would remain closed for generations. The British government said the agreement provided a pathway for resettlement. The Mauritian government said they would consult the Chagosians, but the timeline was vague. The funding was unclear. The infrastructure on the outer islands had been destroyed decades ago. At 2 o'clock in the afternoon on the 4th of October 2024, a Chagosian representative spoke to reporters. Her name was Francoise Verges. She said the deal was a betrayal. She reminded journalists that the British government had spent decades arguing that the islands were uninhabitable. Now they were handing them back in a condition that made resettlement nearly impossible. The shadow of the empire was not just about sovereignty. It was about the physical destruction of homes, wells, and roads. It was about the deliberate removal of people followed by the deliberate neglect of the land. How did the empire continue to exert power through this agreement? The lease for Diego Garcia was set to run until 2163. The base would remain a strategic hub for the United States. The British government would collect rent from the United States and pass a portion to Mauritius. The financial arrangement was not disclosed in full. The Chagosians were not included in the revenue sharing. The empire had transformed into a landlord relationship. The land was returned, but the control remained with the same powers. The islanders were still outsiders in their own homeland. At 8 o'clock in the morning on the 15th of November 2024, the United Nations General Assembly took note of the agreement. A resolution was passed commending the parties. The vote was 153 in favor. 2 countries voted against. The United Kingdom and the United States abstained. The Chagosian diaspora watched from community centers in Seychelles, Mauritius, and Britain itself. They asked whether the agreement was genuine or whether it was simply a way to silence international criticism. The resolution did not mention resettlement. It did not mention reparations. It mentioned only the transfer of sovereignty. The story of the Chagos Islands was not an isolated case. Across the 14 remaining British overseas territories, the same pattern repeated. In Gibraltar, the sovereignty dispute with Spain remained unresolved. In the Falkland Islands, Argentina continued to press its claim. In the British Virgin Islands, a financial scandal exposed how offshore tax havens, products of the imperial legal framework, were used to hide billions of dollars. In Bermuda, the British government imposed direct administrative control after a corruption inquiry. The empire was not a memory. It was a network of legal, financial, and military structures that still functioned in the 21st century. At 6 o'clock in the evening on the 1st of December 2024, the British government published a white paper on the overseas territories. The document was titled A Modern Partnership. It emphasized cooperation, human rights, and environmental protection. It did not mention the word empire. It did not mention the history of forced displacement. It did not mention the Chagosians. The white paper was met with skepticism by academics and activists. They noted that the same government that wrote the white paper had fought for decades to keep the Chagos Islands under its control. They noted that the same government had refused to pay reparations for the transatlantic slave trade. The empire's language had changed. Its actions had not. The shadow of the empire was the shadow of a legal system that could change borders on paper, but could not undo the destruction of lives. The shadow of the empire was the shadow of a military base that remained essential to global power even as the flags changed. The shadow of the empire was the shadow of a people who were still waiting to go home. At 7 o'clock in the morning on the 1st of January 2025, the clock struck midnight again. In London, the bells of Big Ben rang. In Port Louis, the Chagosian elders gathered as they had every year. They sang the same songs, they told the same stories. But this year something was different. The agreement existed. The sovereignty had been transferred. The islands were no longer officially British. The elders looked at each other. They could not decide whether to hope or to mourn. The empire had given up the name, but the control remained. The sun had set, but the light was still too dim to see the way home. The story did not end. It only changed chapter.